Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of MCNC's summer webinar series. My name is Chris Beal, and I'm part of the security group here at MCNC. So on behalf of the organization, I'd like to thank you for attending today. The topic of today's webinar is email security. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that go into the difficulties for keeping email secure and some of the things that we can do as security pros and as email operators to keep email safe for our users. So what we're going to cover in the session today includes some discussion of spam, what is it, how it works, also some discussion of phishing, discussion of spoofing, what is spoofing, how do the bad guys spoof email messages, how do they make spoofing work. And then we'll finish up with some discussion on protecting email, and specifically we're going to look at something called sender verification, which is a way for us to verify that the actual sender of the message is who it claims to be, how we can filter messages based on information that's contained in the body of the message, and then how we can filter email messages based on attachments in order to try to keep those safe as well. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start off with spam. What is spam? So generally we consider spam to be unsolicited email or junk email, and basically this is any email message that is not legitimate or that is unwanted. So if you think about email messages that come into your inbox and that come into other people's inboxes, the definition of unwanted is pretty subjective, because if an email lands in my box, it might be something that I think is junk or I don't want, but it might be something that's very interesting to you. And so the definition of unwanted really depends on who's receiving it. And so this notion of defining spam is pretty subjective. So that's a big reason why blocking spam is tricky. Because you run the risk of blocking things that are legitimate for folks, and then in trying to find that balance, sometimes we get too much spam or we block things that we really shouldn't block. So let's take a look at some examples. This is an email that landed in my inbox advertising a web pharmacy with a link to that URL in Russia down at the bottom. I think we can probably all agree that most folks would not want to receive an email like this. So this one is pretty clearly spam, pretty clearly unwanted email. Not hard to look at that and say, yeah, that's no good. This is another one that I received recently to my inbox. This is advertising leads, sales leads, contact information for targeting network administrators. And you can see that my email client thinks that this is junk message and blocked it for me. So for most people, this would probably be spam or unwanted email. But if I'm working in sales and I'm actually looking to target network administrators to send emails to, I might be looking for their contact information. So this might be something that I would want in that scenario. But for most people, this is probably spam. This is another one that showed up in my spam folder, advertising a conference for the National Association of Corporate Directors. It's a board leaders summit. For me, this is spam. I'm not a board leader, so I'm not interested in attending this conference. So this would fall into the category of unwanted email. But for some folks, this might be something that they're interested in. So for them, it might not be spam. And then this last one here is an advertisement for Walgreens. I'm not interested in receiving that. So for me, that's spam. But you can probably see how there would be people out there who might want to see this information and might be something they're interested in. So let's look at some trend information related to spam. What we're going to talk about here comes from this report put out by Symantec called the Internet Security Threat Report, and this came out in April of 2016. So what they show us in that report is that generally spam rates are on the decline. 2013, 66% of all emails traversing the global internet were considered to be spam. And in 2015, that number is down to 53%. So if you look at the trend line there, you can see that that seems to be a positive trend. But I would point out that still in 2015, more than half of all emails traveling the internet are spam or junk. So that's still not a great situation for us to be in, as half of the traffic related to emails is stuff that's not legitimate. So this is a chart that comes from a tool that Trend Micro operates. And you can see the website listed there at the bottom. You can check that out. And what it shows us is spam trends over time. And they measure this on a daily basis based off of email that they have access to and observations that they make and intelligence that they gather. And you can see at the top that this is in volume in billions of spam messages. The date range here is in January of 2015 through the end of July in 2016. And you can see that generally throughout 2015, the trend is consistent with what was being reported in that semantic report in terms of decline. But once we get to 2016, you can see that trend changing and it's starting to climb again, particularly as we get towards the end of July there. So I just wanted to point out that even though that trend report we saw earlier showed a general decline, it fluctuates greatly, and it actually seems to be in 2016 going in a different direction. So I just wanted to point that out. So let's talk about phishing. What is phishing? Phishing is emails that are designed to trick you into revealing sensitive or confidential information. So this might be passwords, credit cards, bank account information, but generally this is an email that you would receive that's trying to trick you to get you to click on a link where you would enter in your login credentials, make you think you're at a website that you're not, that kind of thing. That's generally what phishing is. So this information comes from a Google report related to phishing. And the question is phishing effective? And what Google found in conducting this report is that for the most believable phishing pages, the best ones, the ones that look the most realistic, those trick users almost half the time. And then on down the line there to the end, they found that the obviously terrible phishing pages, the ones that most people could look at and say, wow, that's really not legitimate, those are successful in tricking users 3% of the time. So even the worst of the worst still capture about 3% of the users that fall for them. So I want to put that in perspective a little bit. You might think, well, 3%, that's pretty good. But let's look at some numbers here. So this is from that same Trend Micro report that I showed you earlier. Again, this volume that we're looking at is in billions of spam messages. And I just picked a single day in August. I picked August 1st, so that's what we're looking at here. And you can see that the orange line there shows that a little over 120 billion spam messages were charted on that day. So if we kind of put this into context with some numbers, if we make an assumption that out of that 120 billion spam messages, that 1% of those were phishing messages. 1% of the 120 billion is 1.2 billion. So we're talking about 1.2 billion phishing messages sent on this particular day. And if we make an assumption that out of those 1.2 billion phishing messages, maybe 10% are the absolute worst of the worst in terms of how believable they are. They're the most obviously bad pages. So in this scenario, 90% fall into the other category, but 10% are the worst of the worst. So 10% of 1.2 billion is 120 million. Now if we take 3% of 120 million, meaning that 3% of the time those users fell for that obviously scamming phishing page, that gives us 3.6 million compromises per day that we're talking about. So again, these numbers are kind of made up. They're just trying to pull some information together. We just want to kind of give you a context that even though only 3% of the time users are falling for the most obvious phishing pages, that's still a lot of compromises that are occurring due to phishing. So something else that's in this Google report that they noted is that hijackers move quickly, and they found that in 20% of the compromises that they saw, the accounts were accessed within 30 minutes of the compromise occurring. So once the phishers get their hands on credentials or information that they're compromising, they're moving very quickly to use it to their advantage. So here's some examples of phishing messages. This one would fall into that category of the most obviously scammy. This is claims to be a notification email from Bank of America. You can see right at the top, it's not actually from a Bank of America email account. It's from a service123.com email account. So that's a tip-off that it's not legitimate. Another big tip-off is the fact that the email client is reporting, hey, this might be a phishing message. So that's pretty obvious. Also down at the bottom, there's this weird spacing in the text in the word bank. The link there doesn't actually point to bankofamerica.com URL. It points to an IP address, which is always an indicator that something is not right with the link. And then you can see more spacing issues at the bottom, and then at the very bottom, the improper use of the English grammar. This mailbox is not monitorized. All those things add up to point out that this is pretty obviously a scam email. This is another example email that appears to come from American Express. If you are an American Express cardholder, you would note that this looks pretty similar to an email you might receive from them. What you would find here in this email, though, is if you hover over the please click here link, that's not actually going to an American Express website. It's going to a fake website that's set up to look like American Express and try to get you to log in, and they would capture your credentials and then try to reuse them. This is another example, pretty common technique, an email that you receive from AT&T telling you your bill is ready to view, and if you note there, it's telling you that your balance due is $1,700. I don't know about you, but if my monthly wireless bill is $1,700, I'm thinking immediately, oh my gosh, there's a problem. I need to contact someone and get this straightened out because that's not right. And hopefully the scammers have provided you a handy login link right in the message to try to get you to click on that to go sort out what's going on. And if you do that, it will take you to a fake login page that looks like AT&T's login. And the scammers, again, are looking to capture your username and password and reuse that. This is an example email that's a different type of phishing. They're not trying to get you to click on a link. They're not trying to get you to open an attachment. This is one we actually received here at MCNC. It came to someone in our accounting department, and it came from, at the top, you can see Patricia Moody. She is our CFO. And it's trying to get the person to reply with information on doing a bank transfer. And so we'll take a closer look at the details behind this message in a couple of slides. But the motive here is to try to trick the employee into giving up information about our bank accounts so that the attackers can siphon money out of those. This is a pretty common thing. We see a lot of this with schools. So you should be on the lookout for these types of messages. So why do attackers send spam? First of all, the goal is to make money. If you think back to that Russian pharmacy email we saw earlier, that was trying to get users to go to a website and purchase medications. The attackers are looking to, in that case, they're running a business. It's not a legitimate business, but they're trying to make money. So that's the goal of a lot of spam, is to drive you to a website to get you to buy something. Another goal with spam oftentimes is to distribute malware. This is a report from that same semantic report showing the proportion of email traffic that contained some type of virus in the email, and you can see that it's been up and down over time, but towards the end of 2015 that was picking up again, and you can see that roughly 1 out of every 120 messages that they saw contained malware in an attachment. And so this information is from the same semantic report, and it's showing the percentage of different attachment types that they surveyed and what percentage of those actually contained malware. And you can see that over 50% of the .doc attachments had some type of malware in them. So that's just an interesting point of information for you all. And you can see more about that in that report. So why do attackers send phishing messages? This is some information coming from the 2016 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. And in this, they talk about motives for phishing. You can see here that it starts with a phishing email that's sent. It either contains an email link or an attachment. It gets sent to someone, and the end of that trail is oftentimes to install malware. And the purpose usually of installing malware is to steal users' credentials, and then they will use those credentials to gain access to the network or to steal other information. So that's a big driver behind phishing emails, is to steal user credentials. So let's shift our gears here and talk a little bit about email spoofing. You'll recall this phishing message that we saw earlier that came from our CFO being sent to someone in our accounting department, trying to get them to reply and include information about a bank draft. So this message did not actually come from Patricia Moody. So how did the attackers make it appear that it did? And this is where spoofing happens. So this is the email headers of that particular message that we were just looking at. You'll recall it appeared to come from Patricia Moody at mcnc.org. But you see here at the top, the return path is actually this eric@tampabaywineandfood.com. So the return path is the actual email address that sent the message. The user doesn't see that. What they see is this from, and that's a header that's set by the sender. So the sender set the from header to appear to be Patricia Moody and the email address there. So that's why it showed up as appearing to come from Patricia Moody. And then the other interesting header here is the reply to header, which says Patricia Moody, but then the email address that's displayed there is the yahoo.com address. So if the user who received the message were to click reply and include the details that were requested about the bank account, that message would not actually go back to pmoody@mcnc.org. It would go to this controller1134@yahoo.com. So the question is, how can the attackers do that? How can they change the information that's in those headers? And the answer is because the sender of the message is in complete control of the specifics, and they get to specify all of the information about the message. And then the server that receives the message just trusts that what the sender provided is accurate, and it presents it to the receiver. That's the unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in with regard to email and how the protocol is established. So it's kind of like expecting to get something like this, and when the message is spoofed, what you end up with is this instead. So let's go back to the headers here, and we'll see that these were the pieces of information that we highlighted earlier. And the question is, well, how specifically do the attackers set this information? There are multiple ways to do that. One of the most simple and effective in demonstrating this is just using a telnet client. You, as a user, can telnet to port 25 on any email server that receives email messages, and you can type in the commands that are required in order to distribute an email message. So you can see here the commands are highlighted in green. The first command that you must type once you connect to the mail server is the hello or extended hello command. So you would type that. And then you type mail from and a colon, and then the email address that you would like the message to appear that it came from. So I can type any message or email address I want here, and that's what will be displayed in the message when the recipient gets it in their mail client. So you can see it's very easy for me to type any email address I want. And then I specify the recipient that should receive the message. And so that's just typing the recipient to command and then the email address of the receiver. And I type the data command, and then I type the body of the message, start with the subject, and then whatever information I want included in the message. So that's how it's very simple to specify whatever information you want to the mail server. That doesn't scale very well for attackers. It's difficult for them to manually telnet into every email server they want to connect to and send lots of spam. That requires a lot of work on their part, so naturally they automate that. This is a mailer front end that can be used to send bulk messages, but you can see it's similar information. You specify the email address that you would like it to appear to come from. You specify the reply to address, the name that you would like to show up, the subject, the body of the message, and then this email list box where you can put in all the email addresses that you would like to send to, and then you just hit send. This is a common tool. Attackers have other scripts that they use to automatically generate these mail messages, but this is how it's being done behind the scenes. So the question is, we know this is bad. We know that this ends up generating a lot of the spam messages that we see, and they make them tricky and appear to come from other places. So what can we do about it? So let's talk about how we can verify senders. So the question is, wouldn't it be nice if the receiver had some way to verify that the information that was supplied was legitimate? So rather than just blindly trusting that this message actually came from pmoody@mcnc.org, wouldn't it be great if I had a way to verify that that was actually the case? So under this sender verification heading, there are a few things that we want to talk about. The first one is something called SPF, which stands for Sender Policy Framework. And what this is a mechanism that allows the owner of a domain to specify which servers are allowed to send email messages on behalf of that domain. So me, as the owner of the mcnc.org domain, I can specify only these servers are allowed to send mail on behalf of mcnc.org. So that's what SPF is. DKIM is the next thing. It stands for Domain Keys Identified Mail. And it's similar to SPF, but instead of specifying the servers that are allowed to send mail, what it does is it provides a mechanism for the receiver to check that the message that they received actually does come from the domain that it claims to come from, and it uses cryptography to do this. The messages are signed cryptographically and keys are published, and it allows the sender to obtain those keys and do the cryptographic checks to verify that the message is legitimate. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of that. And the last piece under sender verification that we want to talk about is something called DMARC, which stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance, which is a whole lot of words, but don't fret, we're going to talk more about it. And essentially what this does is rides on top of SPF and DKIM, and it allows the domain owner to create policies stating what the receiving email server should do if a message fails SPF or DKIM checks. So let's talk a little bit more about SPF. SPF is actually implemented as a DNS record for the domain. And you can think of this as a reverse MX record. MX records are DNS records that exist that if I want to send a message to a particular domain, it allows me to look up that domain and figure out what is the mail server that I should actually connect to send that message. So this is kind of the reverse of that. Instead of checking what are the servers that I need to send to, it allows me to check in DNS what are the servers that are allowed to send on behalf of a specific domain. In order for it to be effective, it requires the sender and the recipient to work together. So the sender would publish an SPF record in DNS for their domain, and then the receiver, when they get a message that claims to come from that domain, it would check the SPF record and see, does the server that sent this message match the authorized senders that are contained in the SPF record? So here's an example SPF policy. You can see that this is a DNS record of the type TXT, or a text record. DNS allows for different types of records. There are A records, which are your straightforward forward lookups. There are PTR records, which are reverse lookups, which match domains to, or host names to IP addresses. There are MX records, which specify mail servers. There are a number of other types of records, but one of those types is a text record, and so SPF takes advantage of that type. So we'll go through these fields here. The first one is V. That's the version information. So that's specified here as SPF version 1. Then this next piece you see in the record is something that says MX, and what that means is that the incoming mail servers for the domain are authorized to also send mail on behalf of the domain. So that's a simple way if you want to say Just use all the things that are already specified as MX record as authorized senders. You can just put that in. If there are other servers beyond just the ones that are in the MX records, you can specify those with this A attribute. And here in this example, it's a:"pluto.example.net. And so what that means is that aside from the servers listed in MX records, pluto.example.net is also authorized to send for this domain. There's an include tag, which you can specify, and what that means is that anything you specify there is anything would be considered legitimate for the domain listed there is also legitimate for my domain. And then the last one is this -all tag, and what that means is that all other machines are not authorized to send on behalf of this domain. And then there's a URL here at the bottom, the openspf.org. That's a great place to go to get started to learn more about the details of SPF. There are several other attributes that are available in SPF records that are not listed here, but if you go to that website, you can read all about those additional attributes and learn more about how that works. So with SPF, there's a couple of other concepts that we want to talk about, and that's soft fail versus hard fail. So if you'll remember at the end of that record, there was a -all. That is specified as a hard fail. There's also, instead of -all, you can put in the record a tilde-all, and that is something called a soft fail. So a hard fail in SPF means that messages from a server not in the authorized senders list should be rejected by the receiver. So if you receive a message and you verify it via SPF and it's coming from a place that's not listed in the authorized email servers, you as the receiver should reject it if that record is set to -all or set to hard fail. If you specify in your record soft fail, you're telling receivers that if they receive a message that's not in the authorized sender list, they should go ahead and accept it, but they should mark it as a failure. That's what a soft fail means. Soft fail was designed and implemented to be used during transition periods. So when SPF was early on, they wanted a way to kind of monitor what was happening. Instead of just blindly rejecting messages if something went wrong, they wanted to allow it to continue to work, but to have a way to note that it would have failed if it had been being enforced. So that's why it was created initially. It's also can be helpful if you're just turning on SPF for the first time and you just want to monitor for a little while and see how much would be blocked if it were completely implemented. So it's generally not designed for production use other than just during a transition period. So that's SPF. Now we want to talk a little bit about DKIM. DKIM is also implemented via DNS records for the domain. But instead of specifying a list of authorized servers in the record, you would instead specify a cryptographic key for the domain. So here's how it works. The sending server uses the private key from that pair to sign the message body and selected parts of the message header, and that generates a signature that is placed inside the header. So there's this DKIM signature header, and then it would be followed by the actual cryptographic signature. So that would be part of the message that gets delivered to the end user. And then the recipient can, once they get the message, they can retrieve the public key from the DNS record, and they can use that to verify that the signature matches what's included in the message. And if the signatures match, then they can conclude that it came from a legitimate sender for that domain. But if the signatures don't match, then they can conclude that it did not come from a legitimate sender, and they can choose what they want to do with the message in that instance. So here's an example DKIM record, again specified as a text record in DNS. The first piece here, you'll see it says default._ and then domain key.myexampledomain.com. So what that is what lets folks doing the DNS lookups know that this is a DKIM record. So you would specify that for your domain as some text, it doesn't matter what it is, followed by a _ domain key dot, and then the whatever your domain is. The second piece is a V, again, a version number that specifies the version of DKIM that's in use. And then the last thing specified here is P equals, and P is the parameter that sets the key for the domain. So that text that's following the P equals is actually the public key from the key pair that's used to sign the messages. And there's a page here at the bottom that you can go to, dkim.org, for additional information on DKIM. So this is an example of a header from an actual email message with DKIM in use. And you can see here is the DKIM signature header that's been placed into the message. There are a lot of things specified here. I'm not going to go through all of those individual attributes. If you go to that website, the dkim.org site, there's information there on what all those attributes mean. But the important part here, you can see at the bottom, is the B equals, and then the text is truncated in this example. But that is actually the signature for this message. So what a recipient would be able to do is query the DKIM record from DNS, pull out the key, and they could verify using that key that the message is, in fact, the signature for what they verify matches the signature that's included in the message. And individual users don't have to do this. The mail server software does this automatically. And you get to set, as an administrator, what policy you want to follow if the DKIM signature doesn't match. So that's DKIM. And then the last thing we want to talk about with sender verification is DMARC. And this is something that's built on top of and enhances SPF and DKIM. So it allows an email domain owner to publish rules for what message recipients should do when SPF and or DKIM failures occur. And it also provides a reporting mechanism for actions performed under these policies. And so essentially what this is if you're a receiver of a message and you do verification via SPF and it fails, you have to decide what you want to do with that message. Do you want to deliver it to your user? Do you want to throw it away? DMARC is a way to allow the sending domain to specify what you want to happen. So you can choose to subscribe to that if you want to push that control back to the sending domain. So with SPF and DKIM, again, the recipient must decide what they want to do with the failures. But DMARC allows a way for the recipient to say, I'm going to let the domain owner set the rules for their domain. So DMARC does not address whether a message is legitimate or not. Again, it's just a framework for what should happen if the legitimacy is determined to be no good. Instead, it requires that a message not only pass DKIM or SPF validation, but it also requires it to pass alignment. And alignment is specified as either strict or relaxed. We're going to look at what those mean here. So for SPF, messages must pass the SPF check first of all. And then with DMARC, the domain in the from header must match the domain that was used to validate SPF. It must match exactly if strict alignment is being used, and it can be a subdomain of the top level domain if you're using relaxed alignment. So that's what that means for SPF. And then for DKIM, the message must be validly signed. The signature, the domain for the signature must align with the domain in the from header. It has to align exactly for strict alignment, and it can align with a subdomain if you're using relaxed alignment. And those are all things that you can specify on your server when you're implementing DMARC. So in terms of implementation, DMARC also uses DNS records to allow you to specify what policy information you want the recipients to follow. So very similar, it's text records just like SPF and DKIM. And I'm not going to go through all the details because it's a lot more complicated than the other two. But this is a really good website you can go to get you more information on how to construct the DNS records. But the format is the same. It's a text record, and then there's a whole lot of attributes that you can add to the text record to specify the different policy elements. And all of those are defined at that URL that's shown there. So we've talked about sender verification and some of the things that you can implement both as for your domain and also as a recipient receiving email from other domains to help verify that senders are legitimate. This is a report that was put out very recently that talks about protection strategies for sender verification, for filtering the body of email messages, and also filtering email attachments. This report comes from the Australian Signals Directorate, which is part of the Department of Defense within the Australian government. And this is a group that traditionally has done some pretty good work in terms of cybersecurity and recommendations on how to keep systems secure. So this is a very new report, just came out in July of 2016. And you can see the URL for the report down at the bottom of the page there, so you can go, and I would encourage you to go look at the entire report. But we wanted to kind of walk through some of the things they list here. For each of those three areas, sender verification, body filtering, and attachment filtering, they have listed out a number of protection strategies, and they tell you how effective each of those strategies is, whether it's highly effective or moderately effective or minimally effective. And this is based on research that they've done over a number of years with entities and organizations inside the Australian government and Australian businesses. So they start with sender verification, and they tell you under the heading of good effectiveness, implementing DMARC to enhance SPF and or DKIM is a good thing to do. They tell you that under the heading of average effectiveness, blocking emails based on a SPF hard fail, and they say that that's average because there are ways for attackers to get around that. That's certainly a step in the right direction, but it's not foolproof. Blocking email on DKIM fail, and then under the heading of minimal effectiveness, blocking based on spam blacklists. Quarantining emails on the SPF soft fail is minimally effective, and they tell you that pretty poor on the effectiveness rating is flagging emails based on an SPF soft fail, marking external emails. And what that means is if you get an email and it comes from outside of your organization, signaling that somehow to the user so that they know that it came from the outside. So those are the controls and how effective they have seen them to be in the real world for sender verification. For filtering on the message body, under the heading of good effectiveness, they say replacing the active web addresses inside a message body with non-active versions. So what that means is that if there is a clickable link that's contained inside an email message, that when the email server receives it, that link would be modified so that it's actually not clickable when it gets to the end user. So they say that is a pretty effective thing to do in preventing users from clicking on stuff that they shouldn't be clicking on that ends up in spam messages. Educating users to hover over a link to reveal the actual destination. They say that's pretty good in terms of effectiveness. Average effectiveness for body filtering, removing active content from the message body. So this would be having the email server strip out any JavaScript or VBScript or any other kind of active content from a message before it gets delivered to the end user so that that stuff can't run in their email client. So that's what they say in terms of protecting message bodies. And then lastly, they talk about filtering, protecting email attachments. So they have several items under the heading of excellent effectiveness for protecting against attachments. The first one is convert attachments to another file type. So what that means is, as an example, if a Word document is attached to an email, convert that to a PDF and deliver that to the end user so that they can read it, but they can't open it as a Word document. They have found that to be very effective. Whitelisting attachments based on file type. So this would mean the notion of blocking all types of attachments by default and then only allowing certain kinds. So if you wanted to say block everything except for PDF files, you would whitelist PDF types. Blocking password protected or encrypted attachments. So this is a technique that attackers use to try to get email attachments past filters that scan for viruses and things like that. They either password protect it or encrypt it so that it cannot be scanned by the scanner. So what they're saying is if you receive attachments like that, just have your mail server block those basically saying if we can't inspect it, we're not going to deliver it to the end user. The next one here is dynamically analyzing attachments in a sandbox. So this is a common technique that's come into vogue in the last few years. There are different vendors that play in this space. Some of the most notable are probably FireEye and Palo Alto. They have products that will send the message over to a virtual machine or a sandbox. We'll actually, within that, open the attachment and see what happens on that device and see if the opening of the attachment triggers some malicious behavior, and they will do that before the attachment actually gets delivered to the end user. So that's what a sandbox environment is, and they've said that's an excellent, effective technique to use. Removing active content from attachments. So we saw before they recommended removing active content from the message body. Here they're saying do the same thing for attachments. So remove macros and things like that from documents that are attachments to emails. Under the heading of good effectiveness, they say you should inspect archive files. So this means look inside of zips, look inside of tar files, inspect them for any malware or things like that. Average effectiveness, whitelisting attachments based on file extension. So you'll notice under excellent they said whitelist based on file type. Here they say average effectiveness whitelist based on extension. So the difference is at the top you're actually going to inspect the file and not rely on the file extension. You're going to open it up and say, is this actually a PDF or is this actually a Word document? Because one thing that attackers like to do is put false extensions on a file and get it to open. Like they may put a .doc extension on a file so that when the user clicks on it, it will open in Word, but the file itself is not actually a Word document. It's a JavaScript or something like that that Word can actually render and execute. So they're saying if you just block on extension, that's kind of average effectiveness because the attackers can abuse that. Minimal effectiveness, blacklisting attachments based on file type. So at the top we talked about whitelisting. Here they're saying if you go the other direction, allow everything but just block certain types. That's minimally effective. Minimally effective is just scanning attachments using antivirus software. That's something you should be doing, but it's also easy to get around with a number of techniques. And then blacklisting attachments based on file extension. So similar type versus extension there. So here we're kind of at the end of the talk portion of the webinar today. There are some references here for information on SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, and then a link to that report from the Australian Defence Signals Directorate. You'll see some Google links under the SPF heading, the DKIM heading, and the DMARC heading. I included those because I know many of our constituents here at MCNC use Google Apps and use Gmail for email. And so those are some specific articles on how to implement SPF or DKIM or DMARC within the Google Apps environment. So those links will give you information on how to do that if you are a Google Apps user. So that's what those are. So I can stop here, and I think we can take questions via the chat window. So if you have specific questions, go ahead and fire those in via the chat window, and I'll be happy to try to answer those. Looks like we have some folks typing there, so we'll give a moment to get those questions in. Okay, well, it looks like maybe that was just a thank you and not actually a question. Oh, here's one. So the question is, what do you do with all the third-party mailers that various departments have authorized to send out their newsletters on behalf of the domain? So I'm assuming that this is in regards to perhaps SPF, where you have to specify all of the servers that are allowed to send, and you don't want maybe you don't have all of the information because you don't know what individual departments have done off on their own. So that is a very common challenge with regard to setting up SPF. Yeah. So there are a few ways that I have seen large institutions handle this, specifically universities. Usually it's done in a very phased-in approach where you have to communicate proactively with these folks and let them know that this change is coming. And this can be a scenario where you utilize that soft fail mechanism where the messages are allowed to come in, but you can track which ones would have been blocked if you turn on the hard fail. And that can give you some indication of things that come in, and you say, well, maybe perhaps this is legitimate, and you can contact the department that's sending that, or contact the sender themselves and say, hey, is this being done on behalf of some customer inside of the university? So that's one mechanism, utilizing the soft fail and monitoring for a while. The other thing is you have to communicate about this policy change, and you have to have support from above to say that, hey, we're going to implement this, and that if you don't give us your list of authorized senders, that your email is going to be blocked and your customers inside the institution will not receive it. And so that's a lot of motivation for them to actually be able to supply the information to you. Sometimes that's easier said than done, but that's the way I've seen universities approach doing that. And it's, in talking with folks at universities, it is an ongoing challenge for them that they have to manage on an ongoing basis. Looks like there's a question, or there's a comment that about the presentation being available. Yes, we will put the slides up and make them available on the website. Are there any other questions? Okay, doesn't look like it. Well, when we post the slides up, the very first slide has my email address on it, so I'm happy to field any other questions that come up after the fact, or if you want to talk about some weird scenario that you've encountered that might be helpful for other folks they might benefit from, feel free to contact me via email, and be happy to try to answer questions or learn from your experience there. So thank you all very much for attending today, and we will be in touch soon. Thank you.